The story of colonial Calcutta in the 19th century is not only a tale of empire and trade, but also one of sickness and despair, a landscape where the intoxicating haze of opium met the grim shadow of cholera. Calcutta, the jewel of British India, was a city of contrasts. It boasted grand colonial buildings, bustling docks, and an expanding merchant class, yet beneath these fairs lay crowded alleys, open drains, and an ever-present fear of disease. In this city, the wealth of empire flowed outward in ships loaded with opium bound for China, while within its walls the poor lived and died under the recurring terror of cholera. Opium was everywhere. It was cultivated in the fertile lands of Bihar and transported through Calcutta, measured and weighed under the supervision of colonial officials, packed into chests, and shipped across the seas. The opium trade was immensely profitable for the British East India Company, and the city became the hub of this narcotic economy. Merchants, officials, and middlemen profited, while farmers struggled under forced cultivation and debts. In the warehouses of Calcutta, the sweet, pungent scent of opium hung heavy in the air, a reminder of how deeply this trade was entwined with the lifeblood of the colonial system. For the British, opium was not simply a drug, it was a weapon of commerce, and Calcutta was its arsenal. But while the wealth of opium flowed outward, cholera stalked the streets inwardly. First identified in Bengal at the dawn of the 19th century, cholera found in Calcutta the perfect breeding ground. The city was hot, humid, and overpopulated. Its water supply was drawn from the Hooghly River, whose banks were crowded with bathers, washermen, and boatmen. Human waste flowed freely into the water, and still it was used for drinking and cooking. In the densely packed neighborhoods, cholera spread with terrifying speed, striking down rich and poor alike, though the poor were always more exposed. Travelers wrote of the suddenness of its attack. A man healthy in the morning could be dead before nightfall. The disease brought cramps, vomiting, and endless thirst, followed swiftly by collapse. Its cruelty lay not only in the suffering it caused, but in its unpredictability. It was said that in the mornings one could see wedding processions on the streets, and by evening funeral pyres on the riverbanks. Calcutta, despite its grand status, was a city where death could visit at any hour, carried in the very water its people relied on. The colonial authorities were slow to act. For them, the priority was not always the health of the Indian population, but the maintenance of trade. As long as the docks were busy and the opium warehouses filled, disease was tolerated as an unfortunate but expected part of life. Public health measures lagged, and when they came, they were often limited or poorly implemented. Cholera did not respect race or class, but the crowded lanes of the poor bore the greatest burden. For Europeans living in their spacious bungalows, the fear of cholera was a shadow that never disappeared, a reminder that wealth could not always insulate against contagion. Meanwhile, the opium trade fueled another crisis. As millions of chests flowed from Calcutta to China, addiction spread there like a second epidemic. The irony was bitter. The same city that exported opium to weaken another nation was itself weakened by cholera, a disease born of neglect. In both cases, human suffering was intertwined with imperial profit. The farmer bent over the poppy fields in Bihar, the rickshaw puller gasping with cholera in a Calcutta alley, the addict in a Canton opium den, all were linked by the same global chain of exploitation. Accounts of travelers, missionaries, and doctors describe a city where the smell of sickness mingled with the smell of trade. The opium godown stood near the very neighborhoods where cholera was most deadly. Ships that carried opium outward often carried stories of disease outward as well, for cholera did not remain confined to Calcutta. It spread along trade routes, moving with armies, pilgrims, and ships, becoming one of the first truly global pandemics of the modern era. Calcutta, as both a port and a plague ground, was its epicenter. The ordinary people of Calcutta endured this double burden. They buried their dead quickly, for the bodies piled high during outbreaks. They boiled water when they could, though fuel was scarce. They prayed to the gods, sought remedies from hakims and vaidyas, and endured. Some sought the temporary escape of opium itself, a cruel irony in a city built upon its trade. For the poor, it was a way to dull hunger or grief, even as it chained them to another cycle of suffering. Colonial Calcutta was thus a city of paradox, a symbol of British power and prosperity, yet also a place of recurring tragedy. Its wealth was built on a drug that enslaved millions abroad, while its own inhabitants were enslaved by poverty and disease. The shining facades of Fort William and the grand offices of the East India Company stood in stark contrast to the crumbling huts of the suburbs where cholera struck hardest. In the story of Opium and Cholera, we see how empire fed on both intoxication and neglect, how the pursuit of profit allowed suffering to spread unchecked, and how the streets of Calcutta became both the center of a global narcotics network and the breeding ground of a pandemic. It is a story not of kings and generals, but of ordinary lives caught in forces far greater than themselves, of farmers, laborers, boatmen, mothers, and children whose struggles remind us that history is often written in the shadows cast by power. The story of opium in colonial Calcutta is inseparable from the story of empire itself, a narrative where fields of poppy swayed under the Bengal sun, not for the nourishment of the people who tilled them, but for the enrichment of distant masters. From the moment the East India Company entrenched its power in Bengal, opium became the backbone of its financial machinery, a crop cultivated under strict monopoly and coercion, transformed into chests of dark resin, and shipped across oceans to fuel an insatiable demand. The wealth that flowed from this trade built the foundations of colonial power in Calcutta, and yet the very people who labored to sustain it often sank deeper into poverty, debt, and despair. In the fertile lands of Bihar, the process began. Farmers who once grew rice, pulses, and grains were pressed into cultivating poppy, often under contracts they could not refuse. Officials of the company dictated terms, providing advances that locked cultivators into cycles of obligation. The poppy itself was a delicate plant, requiring intensive care, irrigation, and constant attention. Its yield was uncertain, and when harvests failed, the burden fell upon the farmer, who remained indebted regardless of circumstances. What might have been a choice became a compulsion, for refusal often meant intimidation or violence. Thus the very food that could have sustained villages gave way to the flour that would sustain an empire's profits. When the latex was extracted from the poppy pods, it was gathered into balls of resin, sticky and pungent, which were then sent to government factories for refinement. In these vast facilities, rows of laborers, often barefoot and hunched, pressed, kneaded, and shaped the resin into uniform chests, each weighing around 140 pounds. The scale of production was staggering, with tens of thousands of chests prepared annually. Inside the warehouses of Patna and later Calcutta, the air was thick with the smell of opium, a narcotic perfume that testified to the scale of an economy built upon addiction. These chests were not mere cargo, they were instruments of power, as carefully guarded as treasure, overseen by colonial officers who ensured every ounce was accounted for. From Calcutta, the chests were loaded onto ships bound largely for Canton in China, where a different kind of drama unfolded. The Chinese authorities had long attempted to suppress the use of opium, aware of its devastating effects on their population, but British merchants, supported by the East India Company, pushed relentlessly to expand the trade. Silver, once the foundation of Chinese commerce, began to drain outward, replaced by addiction. In London, the profits funded industrial growth, political influence, and the consolidation of empire. In Calcutta, the city rose as a colonial capital, its grandeur funded by the narcotic wealth that passed through its docks. Yet beneath this spectacle of prosperity lay human misery. The Indian cultivators received little benefit from the trade, for their contracts ensured that profits accrued to the company rather than to the farmer. The opium system extracted wealth from the land and from labor while giving back only debt and despair. The same peasant who bent over poppy fields by day often went hungry by night, for the cultivation of food crops had been displaced. Hunger and poverty spread even as ships carried away fortune after fortune in resinous chests. The wealth of empire was built not on surplus but on extraction, draining vitality from the soil and from the people who worked it. The city of Calcutta itself became the stage upon which this paradox was most visible. On one hand, the city glittered with colonial opulence. Fort William standing as a symbol of military dominance, Writers' Building as the seat of bureaucratic order, grand mansions along Choringi Road, and the ever-expanding docks along the Hooghly River. These edifices were physical monuments to the profits of trade, and opium was central among those trades. On the other hand, only a short distance from these grand structures lay the crowded lanes where Indian laborers, clerks, and porters lived in squalor, their lives shaped not by prosperity, but by the constant grind of survival. The duality of Calcutta was stark, with the wealth of empire towering over the poverty of its subjects, a contrast sharpened by the knowledge that both were linked by the narcotic trade. The human cost of opium extended beyond India. In China, addiction hollowed out entire communities, creating a cycle of dependence that sapped strength and productivity. Missionaries and reformers wrote of men wasting away, of families broken by the habit, of silver flowing outward to pay for the drug that destroyed lives. And yet from the perspective of Calcutta, this misery translated into wealth, for the trade was legal under colonial law, carefully regulated to ensure maximum revenue for the company. The morality of the trade was debated in drawing rooms and parliament, but the machinery of production rolled on, indifferent to the suffering it caused. For the British, opium was not merely a commodity, it was a pillar of imperial finance, a means of balancing trade deficits, a weapon of economic leverage wielded against China, and a justification for military intervention when Chinese authorities resisted. This system of exploitation depended upon the careful orchestration of bureaucracy and coercion. The opium factories were run with military precision, their workers subject to surveillance and strict discipline. Cultivators were monitored through networks of local officials, ensuring compliance with quotas. Auctions in Calcutta were conducted under official supervision, with merchants bidding for the right to carry chests to Canton. Every stage of the process was designed to extract maximum profit while minimizing any opportunity for resistance. In this sense, opium was not only a drug but a symbol of the imperial order itself, regulated, systematized, and justified by the language of commerce, even as it devastated the lives of millions. The presence of opium in Calcutta was inescapable. The warehouses along the river brimmed with chests, the docks bustled with activity as laborers loaded ships, and the city's very identity became bound to its role as the hub of the trade. For those who lived there, the sight of these chests was a reminder of the vast forces at work, forces that linked a farmer in Bihar, a merchant in Canton, and a factory owner in Manchester. The city was the nexus where these global threads converged, a place where the intoxicating lure of profit blinded many to the suffering upon which it was built. Even within India, opium seeped into local life. While the majority of the drug was destined for China, a portion circulated domestically, creating habits of use among certain groups. For the poor, opium sometimes served as a cheap solace against hunger or pain, a means of dulling the harshness of daily life. In this sense, the crop that impoverished cultivators also ensnared them as consumers, creating a cruel cycle of dependence. The British, however, rarely viewed this as a crisis, for addiction within India was overshadowed by the revenues generated abroad. The arrival of cholera in colonial Calcutta was like a shadow that crept through every alley, bazaar, and slum, revealing the stark inequalities of a city that had been built as the jewel of empire, but functioned as a crucible of suffering for millions. By the early 19th century, cholera had already established itself as one of the deadliest killers of the age, originating in the deltaic swamps and waters of Bengal before sweeping outward across India, Asia, Europe, and beyond. Calcutta, sitting on the banks of the Hooghly River, was both the epicenter and the perfect breeding ground for this epidemic, a city of grand colonial edifices and desperate human overcrowding, a place where wealth and poverty collided, and where the invisible threat of disease moved silently through contaminated water, poor sanitation, and the fragile bodies of the urban poor. The story of cholera in Calcutta is not only a medical story but a social and political one, revealing how empire governed, neglected, and exploited the very populations that sustained it. The disease thrived because Calcutta was a city of extremes. On one side stood the colonial quarters, with their wide boulevards, airy houses, and drainage systems designed for comfort. The British elite constructed their environment with health in mind, or at least what they believed would preserve it, with gardens, distance, and sanitation measures enforced within their enclaves. On the other side, however, sprawled the densely packed native quarters, where labourers, dockworkers, rickshaw pullers, and hawkers lived in cramped huts, often without adequate access to clean water. The water they drew from tanks and wells was frequently contaminated by sewage, for the city's sanitation system was woefully inadequate for the population it supported. It was here, in these cramped quarters, that cholera found its greatest foothold, spreading with ferocity whenever monsoon rains turned the streets into channels of filth, and whenever stagnant pools of water became reservoirs for the Vibrio bacterium. Medical knowledge at the time struggled to explain the nature of the disease. In the early decades of the 19th century, theories of miasma, bad air, dominated explanations of cholera, with British officials convinced that it was the stench of decay and filth that poisoned the body. This misunderstanding shaped public health responses, as efforts often focused on removing odors rather than addressing contaminated water supplies. It would take decades, and the painstaking work of figures like John Snow, to establish the link between waterborne transmission and cholera, but by then countless thousands had already perished. In Calcutta, the persistence of miasma theory meant that those in power often failed to address the very infrastructure that might have saved lives, choosing instead to place blame upon local customs, diets, and behaviors. Cholera's effects on the body were swift and merciless. Victims could go from apparent health to death in a matter of hours. The disease induced severe dehydration through violent vomiting and diarrhea, leaving sufferers with sunken eyes, shriveled skin, and an almost ghostly appearance. Contemporary accounts describe patients collapsing in the streets, unable to reach medical help, while entire households succumbed one after another. In the densely populated neighborhoods of Calcutta, the stench of sickness mingled with the cries of families and the rumble of carts carrying bodies to hurried cremations or burials. Fear spread almost as quickly as the disease itself, for cholera seemed to respect no boundaries, striking rich and poor alike, though the poor bore its brunt in far greater measure. The impact of cholera upon the colonial imagination was profound. For the British rulers, Calcutta was meant to embody their vision of order, progress, and control. Yet cholera revealed how fragile that order truly was. Epidemics exposed the city's inadequacies, its broken water systems, its inadequate housing, its insufficient medical resources. At the same time, cholera became entangled with colonial politics, as British officials often framed the disease as an outcome of Indian backwardness rather than of structural neglect. Reports blamed local practices such as bathing in the river, drinking from tanks, or consuming certain foods, while overlooking the fact that the colonial administration had failed to provide safe alternatives. In this way, cholera became a justification for further intervention, a narrative that reinforced colonial authority by presenting it as the bearer of modern sanitation and science, even as actual reforms lagged behind. Hospitals and dispensaries became the focal points of medical intervention, yet they too reflected the inequalities of the city. European hospitals were better funded and better equipped, while facilities for the Indian population were overcrowded and under-resourced. Missionary organizations often stepped into this gap, providing care where the colonial government fell short. But their efforts could not stem the tide of an epidemic that spread through entire districts at once. In many cases, treatment amounted to little more than palliative care, as medical science had few effective tools against the disease. Opium, ironically, was sometimes prescribed to ease symptoms of diarrhea, tying the two narratives of Calcutta, opium and cholera, together in tragic irony, for one drug that enriched empire was administered, however ineffectively, to treat the very epidemic that destabilized it. The repeated waves of cholera reshaped the social fabric of Calcutta. Families were torn apart, communities destabilized, and the rhythm of daily life disrupted by recurring fear. Each new outbreak brought fresh waves of death, but also new patterns of migration, as people fled infected quarters or sought work in less stricken areas. Pilgrimages and religious gatherings often became points of transmission, with pilgrims carrying the disease from Bengal to other parts of India and beyond. The global spread of cholera in the 19th century owed much to these human movements, combined with the colonial trade routes that connected Calcutta to ports across the Indian Ocean. Thus the city became not only a victim of cholera, but also its vector, the launching point for pandemics that swept the globe. The effect on the colonial economy was significant but complex. On the one hand, cholera disrupted labor, reducing productivity in key sectors like dockwork, transport, and construction. On the other hand, the administration often calculated the losses as bearable compared to the revenues generated by trade, taxation, and opium. Human suffering was weighed against imperial profits, and more often than not it was deemed an acceptable cost. This calculation underscores the brutal logic of empire, where the death of thousands could be tolerated so long as the machinery of extraction continued to function. For the Indian poor, however, cholera meant repeated cycles of devastation that left lasting scars on communities and families. The presence of cholera in Calcutta also fed into broader colonial anxieties about race, health, and governance. The British saw themselves as particularly vulnerable in tropical climates, and the spread of cholera reinforced fears about the dangers of India itself. The disease was racialized in discourse, described as an Asiatic scourge that emanated from Bengal and threatened the health of the civilized world. In this framing, India became not just a colony but a source of contagion, a place that required control and reform. At the same time, these narratives often obscured the role of colonial neglect in fostering the very conditions that allowed cholera to flourish. As the 19th century progressed, efforts to control cholera evolved, though slowly. Improvements in sanitation, drainage, and water supply were eventually introduced, but often selectively, prioritizing European quarters over Indian ones. The construction of piped water systems, for instance, was a long and contested process, and even when introduced, it reached only a fraction of the population. In many ways, the colonial city remained a patchwork of health and disease, with islands of relative safety surrounded by seas of vulnerability. Cholera continued to erupt in outbreaks, each one a grim reminder of the city's unresolved structural inequalities. The psychological toll of cholera cannot be overlooked. For the poor, the disease was another layer of insecurity added to lives already burdened by poverty, debt, and exploitation. For the British, it was a constant reminder that their hold on India, though seemingly unshakable in military and political terms, was fragile in the face of nature's invisible forces. The fear of cholera haunted colonial society, shaping behavior, urban planning, and even the discourse of governance. It became one of the defining features of 19th-century Calcutta, a presence as constant as the monsoon or the river, woven into the very identity of the city. Through it all, the voices of those who suffered were often muted in the historical record. Colonial reports quantified deaths and analyzed outbreaks, but they rarely captured the anguish of families, the silence of children lost to disease, or the resilience of communities that rebuilt themselves after each wave. Yet if we look closely, fragments of those voices remain. In vernacular accounts, in oral traditions, in the quiet acts of survival that resisted the overwhelming force of epidemic and empire alike. These voices remind us that cholera in Calcutta was not merely a story of disease, but a story of human endurance, lived out in the narrow lanes and crowded huts where history's great forces found their most intimate expression. The indifference of colonial authorities in Calcutta during the 19th century, when the twin crises of opium and cholera defined the city, can be understood only by examining the priorities that guided the empire and the mentality of those who governed it. The British colonial administration was designed not as a welfare state, not as a structure intended to provide for the well-being of the population it ruled, but as an apparatus of extraction, taxation, and profit. This underlying logic colored every decision made in Calcutta, from urban planning to public health, from the management of agriculture in the countryside to the operation of shipping routes in the port. The prosperity of the colonial system was measured in revenue and exports, not in human lives preserved or communities protected, and it is within this framework that the devastating toll of cholera can be seen as both predictable and preventable. While thousands perished in the city's overcrowded quarters, warehouses brimmed with opium, chests were sealed for export, and the revenues of the East India Company and later the British Raj continued to flow outward with barely a pause, proving how little human suffering could influence the priorities of empire when weighed against its financial ambitions. In Calcutta, the wealth of empire was concentrated in institutions and structures that served commerce rather than public welfare. The colonial government invested heavily in the port, in the infrastructure necessary to support shipping, and in the facilities needed to store, measure, and ship opium abroad. Roads that connected agricultural districts to the city were prioritized not for the mobility of people or for the safety of villages, but for the efficient transport of poppy harvests. Warehouses were designed with meticulous care to preserve the quality of opium, with guards, accountants, and inspectors employed to ensure that not a single chest was lost to fraud or decay. Yet in the very same neighborhoods where these warehouses stood, the residents lived among open drains and stagnant pools of water, exposed daily to the contamination that carried cholera into their homes. For the poor, no such investments in safety or health were forthcoming. The philosophy of laissez-faire governance, so celebrated in Britain during the 19th century, was transplanted into colonial India in a distorted form. Officials argued that responsibility for health and sanitation lay with individuals or communities rather than with the government, unless outbreaks threatened the stability of trade or the European population directly. As long as the docks remained functional and the export system unbroken, cholera among the poor was tolerated as part of the city's natural condition. Reports written by colonial medical officers reveal this cold calculus, documenting thousands of deaths with the same detached tone used to record harvest yields or trade balances. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to statistics, their human tragedies minimized in order to fit the bureaucratic language of governance. This indifference was not simply negligence, but was actively shaped by the structural priorities of the colonial system. The government in India was financially dependent upon opium revenue, which represented a substantial portion of its budget. Each chest of opium shipped from Calcutta to China meant additional funds for the empire's administration, military, and expansion. Cholera, on the other hand, generated no profit. Its victims were often poor laborers whose deaths, though tragic, were deemed replaceable within a vast population. In economic terms, the value of their lives was negligible compared to the revenues ensured by continuing the trade in narcotics. As a result, the system had no incentive to radically transform the conditions that allowed cholera to thrive, to build comprehensive sanitation systems, to improve housing, or to guarantee clean drinking water for the masses would have required large investments, and those investments offered little financial return for the empire. The death of the poor was thus written into the cost-benefit analysis of colonial rule. Even when cholera threatened the European population, the measures taken were often selective, designed to protect the colonial elite while leaving the broader population vulnerable. Quarantine measures were sometimes applied to protect European neighborhoods, while Indian quarters remained neglected. Water filtration systems were introduced in certain parts of the city but rarely extended to the slums. Hospitals were built with European patients in mind, equipped with better resources, while Indian hospitals were overcrowded, understaffed, and undersupplied. The hierarchy of concern was clear, revealing how racial and class divisions structured the priorities of governance. Cholera epidemics were not isolated incidents but recurring cycles, each one exposing the same patterns of neglect. During particularly severe outbreaks, newspapers and medical reports would sound alarms, prompting temporary responses such as cleaning certain streets or establishing committees of inquiry. Yet once the immediate crisis passed, attention quickly shifted back to trade and revenue. The inertia of the colonial system ensured that fundamental reforms were postponed again and again. This cyclical neglect deepened the suffering of Calcutta's population, as each new outbreak found the same vulnerabilities unaddressed. The cultural discourse around cholera further reflected the indifference of colonial authorities. Rather than acknowledging the structural failures of sanitation and governance, officials and commentators frequently blamed the victims themselves. Indian customs, diets, and religious practices were cited as causes of the epidemic, with reports suggesting that local habits of bathing in rivers, eating certain foods, or living in densely populated quarters made them particularly susceptible. This framing served a dual purpose. It absolved the colonial government of responsibility and reinforced the ideology of European superiority. By portraying cholera as a consequence of Indian backwardness, colonial authorities could position themselves as bearers of modernity while continuing to neglect the systemic changes that could have saved lives. Medical theories of the time, particularly the dominance of miasma theory, played into this narrative of indifference. If disease was believed to arise from foul odors and atmospheric conditions, then the focus on infrastructure such as drainage or water supply could be downplayed in favor of superficial measures like clearing waste from certain visible areas. This allowed colonial authorities to appear proactive while avoiding costly investments. When germ theory eventually gained prominence, it became clear that contaminated water was the key vector for cholera, yet by then decades of lives had been lost due to earlier inaction. Even after this knowledge became available, the pace of change in Calcutta was slow, hampered by the reluctance of authorities to prioritize Indian health over imperial budgets. The voices of reformers and medical professionals who argued for stronger public health measures often clashed with the indifference of the administration. Some British doctors in Calcutta advocated for comprehensive water systems and better urban planning, while Indian reformers highlighted the need for government accountability. Yet their calls were frequently drowned out by bureaucratic inertia and financial caution. To act decisively would have required acknowledging the failures of colonial governance, something the empire was unwilling to do, for it would undermine the legitimacy of its rule. Thus, even well-intentioned proposals were shelved, committees disbanded, and reports ignored, leaving the cycle of epidemic and neglect to continue. The opium trade provides the starkest contrast to this indifference. The meticulous efficiency with which opium was cultivated, processed, and exported demonstrates what the colonial state was capable of when profit was at stake. The same empire that ensured opium chests were perfectly measured and guarded could not ensure that its subjects had safe drinking water. The juxtaposition is haunting. In warehouses filled with narcotics destined for China, every grain of opium was accounted for, while in the slums of Calcutta, human lives were squandered in the thousands with barely a note of concern. The disparity reveals not a lack of capacity but a lack of will, a deliberate choice to prioritize revenue over welfare. The indifference of colonial authorities had long-term consequences for the city. Cholera became normalized as part of Calcutta's identity, its presence expected and endured rather than eradicated. The trauma of repeated epidemics left scars on communities, shaping social behaviors and attitudes toward government authority. Distrust of official interventions grew, as many Indians saw that the government's concern was limited and often self-serving. Public health measures, when enforced, were sometimes viewed with suspicion, seen as attempts to control populations rather than to protect them. This erosion of trust further complicated efforts to combat disease, creating a vicious cycle in which neglect bred resistance and resistance justified further neglect. At the heart of this indifference lay the empire's fundamental vision of its subjects. The Indian population was seen less as citizens with rights to health and welfare, and more as a resource to be managed for labor and taxation. Their survival was important only insofar as it supported the machinery of extraction, and their deaths were tolerable so long as the system continued to function. This worldview allowed the colonial state to operate with a degree of detachment that seems almost unimaginable today, reducing human suffering to background noise in the grand narrative of imperial profit. In examining the history of cholera in Calcutta, one cannot separate the epidemic from the indifference that enabled it. The disease thrived not only because of biological factors, but because of political choices, or rather, the refusal to make choices that prioritized human life. The story of colonial Calcutta is thus not just the story of a city plagued by disease but of a system that deliberately looked away, that saw in every death not a tragedy but an acceptable cost of empire, a system that polished the walls of opium godowns while leaving the drains of the slums clogged and fated, a system that demonstrated in every decision that profit was more valuable than people, and that public health was expendable when set against the relentless pursuit of revenue. The resilience and suffering of ordinary people in colonial Calcutta during the 19th century, when opium and cholera shaped the rhythms of daily life, forms the hidden core of history, the unwritten story that seldom appeared in official reports or colonial records, but lived in the memories, bodies, and struggles of those who endured it. The city itself was built upon their labor, the docks where goods were loaded, the warehouses where opium was stored, the streets where carts rumbled with trade, all maintained by hands that were caroused and stomachs that were often empty. These men and women lived on the margins of survival, facing not only the crushing weight of poverty, but also the twin devastations of addiction and disease. And yet in their ability to endure, to adapt, and to carry on, they revealed a resilience that empire itself could not extinguish. Their lives were marked by suffering, but also by small acts of persistence that enabled the city to function even when cholera raged through its alleys, and when opium cast its shadow over entire families. The suffering of ordinary people began long before cholera arrived in their homes or opium seeped into their daily lives. The agricultural system that fed Calcutta's markets had already been transformed by colonial priorities, with farmers in Bihar and Bengal pressed into cultivating poppy under coercive contracts, forced to dedicate their fertile land to a crop that could not feed them. Families that might have grown rice or vegetables to sustain themselves were instead tied to the cultivation of opium, paid meager advances that often plunged them into cycles of debt. Hunger became a familiar companion, and in years of bad harvests or high taxation, entire villages struggled to survive. For many who migrated to Calcutta in search of work, the city offered no respite, only new forms of hardship. In Calcutta, migrants joined the swelling ranks of laborers who lived in overcrowded quarters, huts crammed together in narrow lanes where air circulation was poor and sanitation almost non-existent. Here, cholera found fertile ground, spreading rapidly whenever contaminated water seeped into wells or when the monsoon rains left pools of stagnant filth. For the poor, disease was not an occasional calamity but a recurring threat woven into the cycles of the seasons. They knew the symptoms well: the cramps, the vomiting, the terrifying speed with which a neighbor might collapse and die. The suffering was intimate, visible in the faces of children who wasted away, in the bodies carried hurriedly to cremation grounds, in the silence that followed the loss of a breadwinner. For families living on the edge of poverty, the death of one member could plunge them into destitution, leaving widows and orphans to fend for themselves in a city that offered little compassion. Opium added another layer of suffering to these lives. For some, it was forced upon them in the fields they were compelled to cultivate, but for others in the city, it became a substance of escape, a way to dull hunger or grief. Small shops sold opium in forms that the poor could afford, and addiction spread quietly through the alleys, Men who had once struggled to earn daily wages found themselves unable to work without a dose, their bodies weakened by dependency. Families bore the burden as wages disappeared into addiction, leaving wives and children to stretch whatever scraps of food they could find. The presence of opium dens, hidden but known, reflected the demand among the poor, not for pleasure, but for a few hours of forgetfulness. Yet even in this, resilience showed itself, for families often devised strategies to survive despite the grip of addiction. Wives took on work as washerwomen, children scavenged in markets, communities pooled resources to care for those who had fallen too deep into dependency. The resilience of ordinary people was most evident in their ability to adapt daily life to the constant presence of suffering. They developed practices of care, however limited, to help one another in times of crisis. During cholera outbreaks, neighbors would carry water for families too stricken to move, women would share herbs or home remedies, and communities would gather to bury the dead with dignity, even when the numbers overwhelmed them. These acts of solidarity were often invisible to the colonial gaze, yet they were the very fabric that held society together when official institutions failed. Temples and mosques became not only places of prayer but also of refuge, where people sought both divine intervention and human comfort. Religious rituals provided a sense of continuity, a reminder that even in times of devastation, life retained meaning and structure. The suffering of ordinary people was compounded by the indifference of those who ruled over them. Reports written by colonial officials often reduced their tragedies to statistics, noting the number of deaths without acknowledging the human cost. Yet within the lanes of Calcutta, every death was a rupture in the fabric of community life. Mothers mourned children, husbands grieved for wives, and entire households were sometimes extinguished in the course of a single week. The suffering was collective, a shared experience that bound communities together in grief and resilience alike. Oral traditions, folk songs, and local narratives often carried the memory of these losses, preserving them in ways that official history never did. Children bore an especially heavy burden in this world. Many grew up in environments where cholera was a constant threat, and where opium use was a visible part of adult life. Some were orphaned by disease, left to fend for themselves in the streets, joining gangs of street children who survived through begging, theft, or small trades. Others were drawn into the cycles of labor from a young age, working in workshops carrying loads, or assisting in households to supplement their families' meager incomes. Childhood was often brief, replaced by the responsibilities of survival. Yet even here resilience was visible in the laughter of children playing in alleys between outbreaks, in the ways they found joy despite hardship, in the games and songs that created fleeting moments of escape from the weight of suffering. Women carried a particular burden in the intersection of poverty, addiction, and disease. They were often left to hold households together when men fell to opium addiction or succumbed to cholera. They managed scarce resources, rationing food, caring for the sick, and finding ways to earn money through domestic labor, embroidery, or selling goods in markets. In times of epidemic, women became caregivers not only for their families but also for neighbors, nursing the ill with little more than herbal remedies and sheer determination. Their resilience was tested daily, yet their efforts were rarely acknowledged in the records of the time. In the shadow of empire, their labor was invisible, yet it sustained entire communities. The resilience of ordinary people also lay in their ability to resist despair through culture, ritual, and tradition. Music festivals and communal gatherings continued even in the midst of hardship, providing psychological relief and reaffirming identity. During cholera outbreaks, religious processions were sometimes organized, both as supplication to the gods and as expressions of communal solidarity. These rituals, while occasionally criticized by colonial authorities as superstitious or unhygienic, played a vital role in helping communities endure suffering. They provided meaning in the face of inexplicable loss, offering a sense that human lives, though fragile, were not meaningless. At the same time, resilience should not obscure the depth of suffering. For every act of endurance, there were countless stories of despair. Families destroyed by addiction, neighborhoods decimated by disease, individuals who succumbed to hopelessness in the face of unrelenting hardship. The resilience of those who endured was not a choice but a necessity, a condition of survival in a system that offered little support. The suffering they bore was immense, etched into bodies weakened by hunger, carved into faces lined by grief, carried in the memories of survivors who lived through wave after wave of epidemic. The resilience of ordinary people was not only physical, but also intellectual and moral. They interpreted the calamities of their time in ways that made sense within their cultural frameworks, seeing disease as punishment, as fate, or as a test of endurance. These interpretations, though dismissed by colonial authorities as superstition, provided psychological tools for survival. They allowed people to frame their suffering within larger narratives that gave it meaning, however painful. In this way, resilience was not just about enduring the physical toll of poverty, addiction, and disease, but also about sustaining the mental and spiritual strength to continue living in a world that seemed designed to break them. The suffering of ordinary people in colonial Calcutta reveals the human cost of empire more vividly than any statistic or report. Behind every chest of opium shipped from the docks was a family that had suffered in its cultivation. Behind every cholera death recorded in official documents was a network of relatives and neighbors who mourned, adapted, and carried on. The empire's indifference magnified their suffering, yet their resilience sustained the city, ensuring that life went on even in the shadow of death. Their endurance was the invisible foundation upon which the colonial system rested, unacknowledged yet indispensable, exploited yet unbroken.